Good morning, y'all. It's good to be with you today. Today is obviously a little different kind of day. For some of you, I'll be seeing you shortly, or perhaps I've already seen you this morning as you're back with us at church. And we're certainly glad to have an opportunity and an ability to come together. For those of you who aren't going to be with us this morning, we also want you to know that we completely stand behind that decision. And we are so glad that we still have the opportunity to come to you online, to be able to continue to worship even in separation. And we want you to know that your decision is supported, and we understand so very much that decision as well. But even though we are beginning to come back together, I do want to take a minute and encourage you to continue to stay with us in our online Bible classes. It's going to be a little while still before we can come back together for Bible class. In many ways, that decision about when we can come back together for Bible class is going to depend on when it is okay for us under guidelines to resume our children's Bible classes. And so as long as we are continuing to be apart for Bible class, we want to continue to meet this way. So I encourage you, just because we're coming back for worship and some of us are beginning to come together again, don't stop joining us every Sunday morning for our online Bible class time together. I'm going to still be here teaching the book of Genesis, and I hope you'll stay with us. In addition to our Genesis videos, this morning we're debuting something new that we're very excited about. Bible class videos for our kids. A number of you have been doing great work with your kids in the midst of our time apart, teaching them through the lessons Karen and I have been sending out each week for our kids' Bible class. But we're hoping to maybe engage even more parents with our new videos. And so if you haven't been doing the Bible class material with our kids, we'd encourage you to check out the new videos. Parents who have been doing the Bible class with your kids each week, we want to thank you for the work you're doing, for the investment you're making in your kids' spiritual growth. And we'd encourage you to maybe use these new videos, and we hope they'll be of a help to you as well. We'll have more videos and things coming out. Hopefully next week we'll have a video up for our nursery age kids, and we're working on some things for our older kids as well. We're trying each and every day to make sure that every week that we are doing as much as we can for our congregation while we're apart. And we hope that these opportunities we have made available are beneficial to you. Well, with that said, we turn our attention this morning to the book of Genesis. Last week, we ended our story with the death of Abraham and reached the halfway point of our story of the study of Genesis, covering the first 25 chapters. But before we move on to the rest of our story, looking at the way that God interacts with and is faithful to the descendants of Abraham, and the way that God's promises to Abraham are continued to future generations, this morning I thought it might be beneficial for us to pause, to reflect upon where we have been in the story of Genesis, and be reminded of some of these big lessons and ideas that have come out of our time together. You see, 13 weeks ago, we began a study of Genesis that started with Genesis chapter 1 and these words: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And we read through and we looked at that creation narrative, and we saw how God created everything from nothing, and how the crowning achievement of His creation was mankind, who it tells us was made in the image of God. And in that we were reminded of who God is. We were introduced to who God is, a God of creation. As we saw the God of creation, we were reminded of the value of that creation. We saw that God looked at His creation and said, "Behold, it is good." And on the last day, when He looked at the entirety of it, He said, "Behold, it is very good." But as part of that, we also should be reminded, as Genesis 1 and 2 does so well for us, that it is special and significant that mankind was made in the image of God. That means that each and every one of us, every human being, is made in the image of God. They bear the image of God. And as image bearers of God, we have a responsibility to treat people with the value that they possess by virtue of bearing the image of God. When we understand that everyone was created in the image of God, it should affect how we treat people. It should shape our interactions with them. It should shape the way we view people and the care and the concern we have for them. Every life should matter. Every person should matter. Every individual deserves basic decency and kindness and compassion, because every person bears the image of God. If this last week has taught us anything, it has taught us of the importance, again, of remembering that every individual bears the image of God, and that we have a responsibility to treat them that way. Every life matters. And it does not matter how someone looks, or how they act, or their politics, or whether we agree with them. As individuals who bear the image of God, we have a responsibility to show the love of God to others. And because every individual who does bear the image of God, we have a responsibility to value them and their lives, and to treat them as someone who matters, because to God they matter. But as we moved through the book of Genesis, we saw that things didn't stay in God's perfect paradise for long. By chapter 3, sin had entered the world, and the whole thing was beginning to go haywire. Sin enters the world with Adam and Eve being tempted and falling at the hands of the serpent in Genesis chapter 3. From there, we quickly see that Adam and Eve have children, and when they do, those children eventually find themselves in a situation where Cain kills his brother Abel. Chapter 5 and chapter 6 remind us of the way that sin only continues to get worse, to the point that in Genesis chapter 6, God decides He is going to destroy the earth with a flood. Everything He had made that He had previously called good, these people whom He had called very good, He now regrets ever having made because of the wickedness that they possess. And in doing so, this reminds us of the consequences of sin. The reality is we live in a broken world, and sin affects every single part of our lives. You've heard me talk about it before. You've heard Luke talk about it at length, the way that sin has indeed broken our world. But as the flood narrative reminds us, it also shows us that God is a God who cannot tolerate sin. The justice of God requires that sin have consequences and that sin be atoned for. But even in His justice, God shows mercy. God is indeed a merciful God, a gracious God, because Genesis also reminds us that one man, Noah, found grace in the eyes of God. And so God, in the midst of a wicked world that He's about to destroy, comes to Noah and He says, Noah, you and your household, your wife and your 3 sons and their wives, the 8 of you I am going to save from what is coming. And you know how that plays out. God tells Noah to build a boat, an ark of gopher wood, to fill it with animals. And on that ark they remain for 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and then another period as the water begins to go down. And after months on the ark, finally the water dries up. The ark comes to rest on dry land. And they come out. And Noah sacrifices to God right there. And God makes a promise that He will never again destroy the world this way. And the grace of God continues. because it doesn't take us looking around very long to realize if the world of Noah deserved to be wiped out with a flood, then our world today most certainly should. The wickedness is indeed great, and God would be completely justified to say, I've had enough of this wickedness, but God isn't going to do that. And His rainbow is a promise of that. But even after the flood, things didn't stay good. Sin was still there. By the time we get to chapter 10 and 11, we find that God has again encountered a problem with mankind where they've become so wicked that He scatters them, or so arrogant and caught up in themselves that He scatters them after their attempt to build the Tower of Babel. That ziggurat structure we talked about. And so as we see here, God scatters the people by language. He scatters them across the face of the earth. But even in this, we are reminded of something very important, that God is the God of the nations. We're going to see this play out time and time again, because even after God chooses for Himself a people in Abraham and his descendants, God still cares for the other nations of the earth. He is still patient and gracious and willing that they should repent. After all, it's going to be 400 years before He gives Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan, just waiting and hoping that its inhabitants will repent. God is indeed concerned about the nations. And so when we think about being people like God, we too should be a people who care about others, who are concerned about people of different races and ethnicities, of different nationalities. Sometimes living in the 21st century United States, it's easy for us to get caught up in this idea that somehow our country is unique, that God has chosen us, the United States, to be His nation. There's no denying that God has indeed blessed this country. But God doesn't have a nation. God has a kingdom and a people, a multi-ethnic covenant family. And because God created all of mankind, because He created the nations, He cares about all of them. And we should too. But from there we finally come to chapter 12 as we think back over our study of Genesis. And in chapter 12 we're introduced for the first time to Abram, a man who lived with his family in Ur of the Chaldees. A man from a wealthy family, we know, who seemingly had a good life. And God calls Abram and He says, Abram, I want you to go to a land that I've promised for you. And I know you don't know where it is, but I want you to leave this land of your father. I want you to take your family and your servants and your possessions, all that you have, and go. And I will tell you where you're going when you get there. And by faith, Abram walked not by sight, but put his confidence in God, and he went. And that's just the beginning. And in this moment, it seems like Abraham was indeed going to be a man of great and mighty faith, and he certainly was. But if our study of Genesis has taught us anything, it also reminded us that Abraham's faith journey had as many steps backwards as it did forwards. That sometimes Abraham would take one step forward and two steps back. As we saw with his encounters in Egypt, with his encounter with Abimelech. Sometimes fear got the best of Abraham, and he walked not by faith, but instead chose to live by fear. But this, of course, is a reminder for all of us. It reminds us that the journey of faith is indeed an up and down kind of journey. There will be moments in our lives where we do act in great faith and trust in God. There will be other moments, though, where we're going to struggle, where we will be faithless instead of faithful. And fortunately for us, like Abraham, we are not measured just by our failures. We are measured by the span of our faithful walk with God over our lifetime. And that should be a reminder for all of us to not allow our failures to define us. I know this may come as a surprise to all of you, but I really don't like to fail at things. I know you're all shocked. I don't do things I'm not good at. And nothing bothers me more than to be reminded of those moments. But what I also know is that sometimes I look at my own life and I struggle to be as faithful as I should, because all I can think about are the ways that I've failed. We cannot let our failures define us, because if we dwell on our failures, we will never move forward in our walk of faith. Abraham did not choose to let his moments of weakness and fear define his life, and we cannot allow them to define ours either. But this question of faith versus fear also reminds us of the stories of Abraham and Lot, right? We talked at length over the last few weeks about Abraham and Lot. Lot, this nephew of Abraham, who at one time Abraham believed would be his heir. But eventually they came to a crossroads. Their estates and their servants could not exist together peacefully, and Abraham gave Lot a choice. And instead of choosing part of the promised land that God was going to give Abraham, Lot chose the land to the east of the river, to the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. It was a land that by sight looked good. It was lush. There was no drought. There was wealth and prosperity and people, and it looked like the good land. And Lot said, I'm going to go there. Lot chose to walk by sight and not by faith. He allowed his fear of the uncertainty of the future to characterize his life, and we know how that plays out. Lot chooses to live in Sodom, and Sodom ultimately is going to be destroyed for its wickedness. But even there, in the midst of God's justice, we see His mercy and grace, right? Because He's willing to spare the city for even 10 righteous people. And even when 10 righteous people aren't found, God still spares the city. Or still spares Lot, rather. He doesn't spare the city, but He spares Lot and his family because of His concern for Abraham. Because of the promise He had made to His faithful servant Abraham. Lot and his family are spared. But even then, Lot struggles to live by faith. The angels have to force him out of the city. Lot's reluctant to go. His wife turns back to go back to Sodom and is turned into a pillar of salt. And when Lot and his daughters finally get out of town, the story reminds us again of a great wickedness and deception, showing that apparently Lot hadn't been a very great father in rearing his daughters as faithful servants of God. Probably because Lot had not been a very faithful servant of God. So in Abraham and Lot, we see two outcomes. One where Abraham walks by faith, and the other where Lot chooses to walk by sight, to allow his fear to define him. And what very different outcomes they had. But all of this does remind us, of course, of the story of Abraham. Abraham's not going to be done with his moments of doubting. You know, God promises him to be the father of many nations. But Abraham is getting old, and even after he's in a covenant relationship with God, he still doesn't have an heir of his own. And so his wife Sarah comes up with this plan where Abraham would marry her maidservant Hagar and have a child. Abraham was not patient in waiting for God to bless him and took matters into his own hands. And he does have a son, Ishmael. But that causes tension. It puts strain in the relationship between Sarah and Hagar between Abraham and Sarah, and eventually their son Isaac and Hagar and Ishmael. And eventually, as we saw, Abraham is going to cast Ishmael and Hagar away. Send them away, cast them out of his family. But even then, he was very upset about it. But God saw them, and God had compassion on them. On 2 different occasions, we saw that God had compassion on Hagar and Ishmael and blessed them, reached out to them. One of them was when the tension first emerged, and Hagar fled to get away from Sarah. And God saw them in a moment of need, and He had compassion on them and cared for them. In society, Hagar and Ishmael would have been those without any rights. They would have been the disenfranchised, those who were systemically kept down, overlooked by society. But God saw them. He had eyes looking for those who were in need. And when He saw them, He cared for them and had compassion on them. As we think about being image bearers of God and reflecting God in our actions, we too must be people who look for those in our society whom others overlook, who have eyes that are open to see needs and to meet those needs when we see them. Because the God that we serve, the God whose name we bear and whose image we reflect, sees those whom others overlook and has compassion upon them. Well, eventually God does fulfill His promise to Abraham. And at the ripe age of 190, Abraham and Sarah respectively have a son, Isaac, the child of promise. And finally it seems that God has done what He has promised to do. And so in the midst of this, imagine the anguish that Abraham must have felt when God then comes to him and says, I know this is your child of promise. I know I finally gave you the son I've been telling you for 25 years I would give you. And now I want you to take him up to Mount Moriah, and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice to me. Imagine how that must have hit Abraham. But Abraham understood by this point the God he served. And in this moment we see Abraham's greatest moment of faith, because he was confident that the God who had given him a child when he was essentially as good as dead. Abraham and Sarah were too old to have had a child on their own, but God gave them one anyway. Abraham was confident that that God, who had given them a child when they should not have had one, could also bring back to life that child if He sacrificed him. That's what the Hebrew writer reminds us of and brings to our attention in Hebrews chapter 11, which we're going to talk a lot more about in our summer series that kicks off Wednesday night. But that was Abraham's great moment of faith, because he pulls the knife back ready to slaughter his son, and God steps in. He says, do not harm that child, because for today I know, Abraham, your faith. I know that you have withheld nothing from me, that you have surrendered it all, confident in my faithfulness and my provision. And that, folks, is the reminder that we need to be reminded of today. God calls us to sacrifice and surrender everything, to put our trust and assurance in Him, because He is faithful. And His record is faithful, and He is going to provide, because that is who He is. And what great news that is. That we still serve the same faithful, providing God of Abraham. And at times that requires so much faith that it makes us hurt. Because we struggle. I struggle. You struggle. We all struggle to put that kind of trust in God. We shouldn't. We know that God is faithful. We can look back on our lives and see all of the things that He has done and all of the ways He has been faithful and all of the ways that He has provided. We know better than to doubt God. But y'all, it's still hard. I'm in a stage in my life right now where I've been praying a lot that God will lead me, that He will provide. And I know that He will, because I've seen how He's led me to this point. I've seen His faithfulness. I've seen His provision. But I still find myself needing to pray that God will help me to remember that. Because sometimes life is hard. And we struggle to remember the God that we serve. But as we come to the end of Genesis 25, chapters 23 and 25 showed us the death of Abraham and Sarah, respectively. Or Sarah and Abraham, respectively. And in those moments we again saw faith. Even in something as simple as where they would be buried, Abraham put his faith and his confidence in God. He chose to be faithful all the way to death. And that, of course, is the same call that we've been challenged to. God calls us to be faithful unto death. Paul tells us to fight the good fight, to keep the faith, to run the race until our last breath. Revelation reminds us that if we do so, we will obtain the crown of life, the crown of righteousness, the crown of victory. And so as we reflect back over Genesis 1 to 25, it's much more than just a great story. And it's full of great stories. But in Genesis 1 to 25, we are introduced to God. And we begin to see the God that we serve. We see what it looks like to live as servants of that God, living lives of faith rather than fear. And if Genesis 1 through 25 teaches us anything, it teaches us the importance of living lives of faith, of living a life that is characterized by reflecting God in all that we do, to everyone we encounter, in every situation, not letting our failures define us, but living each day trying to take one step forward in our faith every day until the end of our lives. Confident that the same God who was faithful to Abraham will be faithful to us. Putting our hope and our trust and our assurance in His promises, knowing that something greater is in store. Folks, Genesis 21 through 25 is so much more than a good story. It's a challenge for all of us for how we should live lives of faith and godliness. May we always strive to be those kind of people. People who reflect the love of God, reflect the image of God, and live lives of faithful obedience.